thumbs up. And yes, please participate in this session in a way that makes you feel comfortable. While it's designed to be an interactive workshop, um, I definitely want us all to be doing a lot of internal reflection and work, and there are going to be a lot of times for you to stop and journal in between my describing aspects of discernment. So if that's something that works better for you, handwriting, and you need to go grab a pen and a paper, go right ahead. Feel free to open up another window where you might type some reflections for yourself privately. And while I absolutely welcome sharing in the chat, I suspect the nature of what we move through may actually be richer if it is internal work through a lot of the session. And so feel free to, yeah, do what it takes for you to be comfortable entering into that kind of a rhythm. Um, okay, let's see. So let's start. Here's an arc for our journey together. And before we move into a grounding that I'll lead us in, I'd like you to just call the first three questions on the top of the screen to mind. Where does discernment feel strained in your life right now? Where does it feel hard to find? Um, and and if the word discernment feels new, I'm so curious how the word might be translated into other languages and what words you might use, especially in Spanish or Portuguese, or the language of your heart. So feel free to put that in the chat. But if that word is feeling foggier, or unfamiliar, just ask yourself, what is both unresolved and unquiet in you right now? Where do you perhaps feel a little bit unsure about what to call in and what to keep out? What to hold, what to let go? I'll give you a second to call that to mind as I bring us toward our grounding. Let's arrive. The song helped me arrive for sure. You can go off camera for this if it's helpful. One hand on chest, one on belly, and feel the rest of your fingertips on your torso. Breathe in to slowly lift them. Breathe out to slowly lower. Allow yourself to breathe slowly here, deliberately, pulling in air. Breathe out slowly, pushing the air to the sides of your throat. I want you to try to breathe in a way that creates some drag, some friction. You can really feel that air exchange. You might try using almost pursed lips to slow the flow, to hold back while still allowing the exhale. You might try switching between nasal and oral inhales. Just notice which allows you to regulate with ease and hold those words together. Easeful regulation, not always things that sit right next to each other. Let it be a contradiction that can smooth. Now you might texture your breath, maybe just short of a growl with a little bit of a hum in there. Maybe the growl comes. And as you do that, let's start to feel into discernment. As you look for discernment, you might find that you land somewhere closer to sterile judgment, a place where you might pick up the scalpel of right and wrong. If that's where you are, pull back a little. If you landed closer to something like haughty jurisdiction, sort of the ability to universalize your perception and your choices, let's feel around again. That's not discernment. You're seeking something that's run through with bundled nerves and sensation, something more electric and synaptic. something with breath and charge and pulse and flow. It helps me to imagine the breeze at the back of my neck, a leafy vine climbing toward the sun, whiskers brushing in the dark, the listening bones inside the ear, the way I pause before stepping on ice, and what happens in my body, the tightening in my chest that doesn't go away when my body is trying to tell me not yet, not this way. And maybe most potently, those moments to milliseconds right before a kiss, maybe before a first kiss. Now you should be nearer to discernment and approach it as if to dance. One step toward and one rock back, leaning close, tilting away, weight back on your heels, and then drop in and hold. We're going to let this be something fluid enough to reshape with context, but solid enough to hold the shape you put it in for a little while. Porous enough to admit mystery, uncertainty, protective enough to guard against pillage. It can be slow, but it's got to be propulsive enough to resist gravity for just long enough to get a little air, to take a little different view. Breathe one more time with that sense. And just take a moment as we return and step into a more explanatory phase of this to jot down any words or phrases, any notions or sensations that are front of mind right now, any sensations that are moving towards words before we move into our next phase. Because we are living in an era of endings. Stories are expiring, desires are flaking apart, extinctions and endings of life forms are happening all around us. Institutions are breaking down, coming apart. There are endings of innocence about modernity's promises, endings of confidence in things like endless growth, of progress, and even rescue. And how we each experience this particular era of endings depends so much on how we were positioned relative to the earlier endings that laid a shiny but ultimately very shaky foundation for the present. So, what do we do with our very consequentially timed lives? What do we do with this temporarily animated assemblage that you call you, that you give your name? Um, we each have a distinct expression of aliveness. Where do we put the attention of that expression? What do we want to transmit to and cultivate in others as educators? How do we engage in education ourselves ongoingly? These are all questions that require discernment. And I spent nearly 2 decades in higher education, somewhat unconventionally, more of a pracademic than a traditional academic. Um, and towards the end of that time, I discerned that the kind of education that I most wanted to cultivate the conditions for couldn't survive within legacy institutions. And I came to understand that my work in this phase of my life has to be about co-facilitating or facilitating co-learning from a place of generative uncertainty. And that's not the only kind of education we need. It's not the only kind of posture that folks can take with integrity, but it is mine. And so about 8 months ago, I co-founded a new cosmolocal learning community called Otherwise, we are collapse responsive, land-based, committed to entangled liberation, and open to imminent mystery. And if we have time towards the end, I'll tell you a little bit more, or Nakasi, who's here with us, will also drop some links in. But I like to say that we live the questions that protect what's still possible. And two such questions for us are, what is discernment, and how do we hone our collective capacity for it? I got really interested in this word, this concept, in the distinctions between discernment, judgment, and jurisdiction, um, by studying with the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective and encountering Vanessa Andreotti's work, which I'm seeing some nods. I'm not surprised there's familiarity in this group. Um, and I've put a quote there on the screen. I won't read it for you. You can do that yourself. But the idea that what we need now is a combination of maturity, sobriety, discernment, and accountability was really central to the work I wanted to do. And I've put this up. This, when I've taught from Hospicing Modernity, is one of the hardest parts of that book and that work for people to grasp. In a book club I led about it about a year ago, we spent so much time on just this piece, kind of figuring out what hospicing involves and what midwifery involves. And so if we are hospicing the death of modernity, that involves intellectual accountability and existential surrender. And when we are assisting with midwifery, when we're assisting, not creating something new, the conditions for that to emerge, that requires existential accountability and intellectual surrender. And intellectual surrender, I have learned, is really, really a part of the work of discernment. It's not the whole thing. Um, we have to remobilize our intellect, but we have to integrate it. And so I wanted to just ground this in this frame because this was really important for me at the beginning of trying to deepen a discernment practice. So for right now, I would like you to surrender just one imprint of colonialism that helps you frame your interpretation of reality. Think about one thing that for the last several centuries we've just taken for granted. Um, you're not going to do all of this in the 2 minutes I'm going to give you. You're not going to do this maybe in your lifetime. This is lifetime work. But let's try to like loosen just one. Because as Vanessa says, this is what it takes to make a little space for the land to dream through you. And maybe you've been doing it for a while too. If you know a way you've been doing this, just kind of notice that right now. And just remind your intellect, especially if you're someone who grasps for intellect first, that it is actually essential. It's essential for guarding against fantasies and projections and distractions. And it's going to come in with other roles, but it can't do discernment alone. I think about discernment a lot as a braid and about discernment as an activity that is happening. It's wandering through the body. It's navigating clusters of nerves through the gut, the heart, the breath, and the brain. It's a confluent capacity, sort of whirls where my intuition and my intellect arrive with equal force. It's for perceiving patterns and sensing surrounding stories, knowing when I'm trapped in a story too, one that I might have been telling myself for a while. And it involves moving between serious consideration and action with deep, deep integrity. So try to think about what are each of those parts of me, because they're all one, and then they're also distinct, just like we are all one, and we're each distinct. What are they each sort of doing most of the time? Really, I find that the gut is what's orienting. I feel visceral contraction or expansion. I feel that churn or that softness and ease. There's resonance through the heart space, right? Attunement, echo, pulse, variability in your heart rate and pressure, blood pressure, depth, modulation through the breath as we practiced, a way of pacing ourselves. Also, just a very literal form of exchange. We could talk about eating as a form of exchange too, but that literal form of exchange, the capacity to control within reason when and how we hold and what we release, and integration in the brain, the story awareness, the pattern sensing, the reason, the intellect that we just talked about. And so I'm wondering which of these strands tends to be thickest for you, right? Which do you tend to reach for or respond to first? And which are you more likely to downplay or to distrust? That's a really important thing to consider. Are you all instinct all the time? Do you go right to your head? Take a moment to reflect on that. And as you do, I will say that when we're braided well, we can do pretty incredible things. We can hold and move with paradox. We can track multiple timelines. We can actually stay with discomfort for longer. Um, we are more able, often with external support, to heal from or at least create health around pain and trauma. We can determine when we need to intervene and when it's still okay to refrain or restrain ourselves. When to deepen collaboration and when to diverge. I will say, as I go through this, that I had a real strain on my capacity for discernment just last week. And it was around this bullet point, when to deepen collaboration and when to diverge. And it was the kind of strain on my discernment that was waking me up in the middle of the night. And so on one of those wide awake 2 a.m. kind of moments, I got up and I went to all of my materials around discernment and I pulled out my practice pages and I moved through the process. And I, within a matter of hours, knew how to move next, knew what that next small responsible thing to do in reach was. Um, it enables us to act even amid uncertainty. It enables us to sometimes act provisionally and not sever, but also not like allow flooding. Um, it can help us to course correct without annihilating ourselves or exiling other people. And I think it's important as we seek to step into collective protection work as well, which for those of us here in the US is becoming increasingly urgent and present. But when those four capacities and parts of ourselves are not integrated together, when they're not all providing attention and input, um, we can find ourselves grasping for certainty or premature clarity. We can find ourselves seeking or demanding reassurance, hardening and judging others, being really impatient. It's actually a place where I notice it in myself. If I'm getting super impatient, I know that I need to slow down and move out of judgment mode. We might be really like insistent on consistency, or we might slide into overconfident pronouncements, over functioning, numbing, and sometimes disappearing, even as we're really like in the mix of something, very involved, but kind of losing ourselves. And just notice if you find this happening or find it happening around particular issues, topics, situations. I want to ground this a little for a moment, in neuroception, and polyvagal theory, and autonomics, which I am not an expert in. I would never present myself as one, but I've also been drawing from the work of folks in this field, and it's a field that's in flux and constantly shifting. But I think it's important to remember that before we engage in thinking and reasoning, our nervous system has already assessed how much energy is available within our organism and where to allocate it, right? And Dr. Stephen Porges, I think maybe as early as like the mid 90s, named the body's unconscious detection of safety, danger, or life threat neuroception. This is that precognitive reading of other beings around us and their energy, tone of voice and soundscape, all of that sensory input, the micro expressions that I can see on some of your faces right now that tell me whether I should speed up or slow down or where you might be, posture and how relaxed or tense someone is, what they appear to be preparing to do, signals of unpredictability or volatility in our environment, power gradients, environmental instability, weather, things like that. And then there's interoception, right? The ability to feel inside of ourselves. And so neuroception and interoception are happening together. And the autonomic nervous system can cooperate with or co-opt all of our exterosenses, our vision, our hearing, our smell, our taste, our touch, to put them in service of the autonomic nervous system when necessary. Autonomics, a field that Gabriel Crom writing in extensively right now, which was rooted in polyvagal theory, but built around it, posits that there are three major systems acting in concert with each other: a connection system, the ventral vagal, a movement system, what activates us, the sympathetic mobilization, and a grounding system, which is our subdiaphragmatic vagal regulation. And so discernment really depends on the autonomic conditions that make that reflective and integrative capacity possible for us. We also, this is another one of Crom's ways of explaining things. We experience sort of hot stress and cold stress, right? So you can think about hot stress as the stuff that's maybe what we more think about as stress typically: urgency, reactivity, tight breath, compulsive doing and fixing, getting in the midst of everything. And when we're under hot stress, our behavior can really look a lot more like lashing out, like centering narrower or near-term interests, narrow boundary intelligence, and our own self-importance. We become the center of the story. Under cold stress, this is often somewhat dissociative, numbness, fog, digestive disturbance, inability to eat, withdrawal, masked as calm. And the kind of behaviors that are common here actually, I think, can seem a lot like reasonable compromise, good management, the veneer of responsibility, kind of doing things that are seen as very respectable according to those heuristics and stories that are expiring without actual ability to respond. And so it becomes really important to think about regulation and proportion. And regulation here is not calmness, right? Um, we're not always in an oxygen crisis. And I think a lot of times when we're under hot or cold stress, we either tell ourselves or more often others remind us of this conventional wisdom. Oh, you have to put your oxygen mask on first. You can't pour from an empty cup. And these things are true, but we're often reaching for those metaphors without assessing whether we're in an oxygen crisis, right? Because we can only survive for a matter of minutes without oxygen. And so if it's that kind of situation, yes, you do need to put your oxygen mask on first. But we can survive hours without shelter, assuming we are in cold, wet kinds of temperatures. If we are in warmer, more pleasant ones, we can survive much longer. We can be exposed to hostile sort of conditions and elements for hours without shelter. We can actually go days, not weeks, but days without water, weeks without food, and months without contact before we really deteriorate and might lose our life. And so you can't pour from an empty cup. That is true. But you can pour from a cup that is almost empty. And if you are in a water crisis or a food crisis and you have others around you, you might need to pour from that almost empty cup because if you can get both of you just a little more time, you might be able to travel in two different directions looking for water. And what if your companion is the one who finds it and brings it back, right? And so, as we are in this era of compressive stress, hot and cold, I think it's really important for us to use much greater precision in our self-care and capacity metaphors rather than treating everything like an oxygen crisis, which reinforces individualism over interdependence. It's not that we don't sometimes have to tend to the self first, but we need to think about which version of threat we're experiencing really carefully. And the thing is, once we're activated, when we're when we're in those highly activated autonomic states, we're not doing this kind of discernment without slowing down, and we're often running with the cues we're being given. And so if someone tells us, like, oh, you've got to put your oxygen mask on first, you can't pour from an empty cup, either we will ignore that because we are so looped up, or if it lands, we will go with that without thinking about and assessing, without discerning and feeling deeply which kind of situation we're in. So I'm going to give you a longer minute here to personally reflect and try to recall a recent conflict or tension. Could be big, could be small. Try to grab for the one that's coming right up for you. Um, did you regard it as an oxygen, shelter, food, or water or connection crisis, right? Which temporality did it have? Were you treating it as though it needed to be resolved within days? And maybe it did. But just consider if you engaged it as something faster or slower, more urgent or less urgent than it actually might have been. I'm going to give you 2 minutes on that. We're making decent time here. I want you to really reflect on this. The next layer I want to engage here is about permeability and protection. Discernment for me also really hovers at the boundary. It's a very membrane-like capacity. Um, some of you may join me on Saturday, early in the day, my time, for a People Need People session. I've spent a lot of time in the last year or so immersing in Nora Bateson's work and warm data. And in those spaces, we often talk about the ever-shifting edges of the self and other. Where is the edge of you? Where is the edge of me? What is the boundary between good work and my work? How do we distinguish that? What's the balance between the boundlessness of my love and my limited ability to mobilize actual real care in a more material, tangible way. These are not fixed. These are not walls that we're building. They're porous, but they can't let everything in. And so, if our boundaries have become too permeable, we experience crowding and overwhelm. We might experience sort of energetic or emotional contagion. If too much gets in there that isn't ours, um, we can really feel a loss of our own orientation, right? Our compass just kind of keeps spinning, stops pointing north, or a dilution and a thinning of what it is we can distinctly do and offer. On the other hand, if we are too protected, we get really cynical. We can slide into superiority and supremacies, including intellectualized ones. We can we can find ourselves dissociating, not just in the psychological sense, but in the sense of removing association with and limiting our relational range. We can refuse intimacies that might actually shift and change and grow us in interesting ways. Closure to combining is dangerous. It's really dangerous. It's also bad for life. So there's a balance here, and it's a dynamic balance. It's also sort of a tensile capacity, right? So I think part of what we're trying to do here, I'm going to let you actually just look at the screen and see if you can find and follow some of the tensions. For me, there are tensions between, active hope and grounded sobriety, between recognition of danger and knowing when I'm going to step in and assume a necessary risk. Um, between patience and urgency, between intervention and restraint, as we spoke to before, also between grief and joy, and between plan and play. That one is a really tough one for me, particularly when time feels short, right? Um, and so now I'd like you to try to recall a situation, first one that comes up, where you were overextended. Or if that's not you, maybe one where you withdrew too far, where you let too much in, or where you built a wall too firmly and too fast. And try to think back to that. It can be hard because you may have already resolved this, or it might be very present right now, which is a little easier. But in that case, what did your gut signal? What did your heart signal? What did your brain impose? And did you use your breath? That should be on here. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to reflect on that as well. Probably not enough time. And as you think about this, you might picture a net. Each string in a net is holding through distributed tension. So it's okay if these signals are pulling in different directions. Permeability and protection, they're not opposites, they're co-regulators. I also see a note in the chat about whether we will share our stories. And yes, I'm trying to move through quickly enough that we'll have some time where if sharing feels good at the end, there's space for that. But I would like to take us through the rest of this process first. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of the reasons that things are shitty right now. Y'all know. That's why you're here. Um, we are experiencing a lot of intensive compression and so much high demand in our capacities. Um, and this can warp perception. So I'm coming back to this hot stress, cold stress framework. When we're in this compressive state of overload, whether we're experiencing an intentionally flooded zone, or we are in personal crisis, or we are trying to navigate our communities away from the brink that they are seem to be hurtling towards, um, and we're experiencing hot stress, we can overestimate threat. We can engage in problematic othering, and sort of identify enemies. We definitely reduce our space to hold nuance, and we tend to seek control. When we're under that more numbing, dissociative form of cold stress, where we might disappear while being present, we tend to underestimate consequence and particularly underestimate our own risk. We other that risk, right? The problematic othering is like, but probably I'll be fine. Probably my town won't flood. Probably. Um, we also tend to avoid contact, and this can lead us to disengage from our own agency. Both of these, in different ways, distort our perception and morph timelines. We might inflate immediacy and personal risk, or drift into a very dissociated kind of futurity where we forget how entangled we are with the rest of everything. And so I've said now a couple times that, like, when the braid has integrity, we can hold multiple timelines, move with multiple time signatures. And here I'm really talking about sort of deep time and lifetime, right? And even that is like an outrageous simplification. When I talk about deep time, am I talking about the time of the cosmos? Am I talking about time of Earth? Am I talking about the timelines of life on Earth or of humans on Earth? But all of that is deeper than lifetime. And then, of course, the way we experience lifetime changes over the course of our lives. A day is much longer for a 4-year-old child than it is for his 72-year-old grandfather. The time between major holidays, like let's use New Year's for now, because those are pretty universal. The time between New Year's, whether on the Gregorian calendar or the lunar one or any other calendar, that felt really long when you were a kid, even when you were a teenager. The school year felt really long. And the longer you've been a professor, the shorter it gets each time. So we're living inside overlapping realities, a single lifetime within spirals of deep time on this precious wounded Gaian planet. And we need to be able to dance in both time signatures and to walk in at least two worlds, the one that is ending, the ones that we are trying to bring apart. And so many people who try to do this, who don't engage a deep discernment practice, who don't engage in co-regulation regularly, they quickly tumble into apocalyptic certainties or predictions. And or they retreat into the cool comfort of reform fantasies and techno solutionism. And it's all generally like not great, honestly. And I think the technologies that have been sort of developed and mainstreamed around us, they're making this worse right now. Um, they're definitely kind of using algorithms to push our attention, to make everything fast, to jumble everything up. And they're really bad for discernment. And I think there's a lot of what's happening with AI and particularly more agentic AI now, where like we can increasingly live inside of a very bounded bubble, or think we can live, at least for a period of time, within a very bounded bubble of self-reinforcement. Um, and that's dangerous too. Okay, we're going to get really practical here. I would like you to try to identify one live discernment, one thing that isn't in your past, but that is here now, and identify some suboptimal conditions that are shaping it. I'm going to recommend that you limit it to three for right now because of how much time we have. Just what are you trying to make sense of, to discern, to hold? What is sitting in that unresolved, unquiet way? And what's making it hard? And as you write that down, notice what's happening to your breath. Notice where it's sitting in your body or what it's pinging between. And see what timeline or world or story might be just dominating, hovering around this. Does anything shift if you enlarge or shorten that sense of time? Are you feeling too attached to something that needs to give way in the world as it is now? Are you reaching too far? Are you grasping for something that's still out of reach or beyond your leap? Is the way that you're mobilizing to act around it generative or is it defensive? And if you're feeling still, is that stillness more avoidant or restorative? You may need a lot more time to sit with this. And while I'm going to share some stuff afterwards, and I can certainly put some things in the shared notes, this is a good one to screenshot if you want to actually sit with this practice with something live for you right now, because it's useful to really sit with those questions. And I've done this. And then name this next small, even the smallest workable step. Not the one that's even responsible yet, one that keeps your capacity intact to keep sitting with it, to figure out what the next small responsible thing to do within reach is. And in our grounding, I quickly kind of tried to guide you away from judgment and jurisdiction. And I did that because they're not discernment. They're really distinct. However, they're not bad universally and uniformly. And sometimes we do have to exercise judgment. And sometimes, in certain, much more limited situations, we also have the authority, formally or informally, to decide, to act, to govern. Um, I think quite often we reach for these when prematurely or out of context and bypassing discernment. So judgment asks like, well, what is the verdict here, right? Like I maybe I sat with it for a little while. I considered all the angles, but we have to make a choice. This is the evaluation, the conclusion, and it also comes typically with some like binary choosing or like from a short set of selection criteria. Judgments are often made according to established criteria that are maybe externally imposed and purportedly objective. And this can be useful for clarity when harm must be stopped immediately, but it can easily turn into moral superiority, especially when working across cultures and contexts and places, power gradients, histories of extraction and oppression and marginalization. Jurisdiction is about like who decides, who has the authority to decide. And it's often necessary in governance, but it can be really corrosive when it's divorced from relational grounding or when it's imposed in a situation where governance is not the work. So for right now, you might be sitting with some evaluation of me and this session. You might be evaluating or judging whether it's worth your time. You might be discerning whether you need more or less of this kind of input as you sit at the conference over the next couple of days and participate. All of those things would be appropriate. If you tipped over into exercising jurisdiction over whether or not something like this is worthwhile in the world, you're probably presuming an authority that you don't have. And it's often a place where humility falls out. I try to do a lot less jurisdiction. And you wouldn't have known it from anything I said otherwise here, but I'm trained as a lawyer. So I was trained for jurisdiction. So yeah, another thing to think about, and I want to go through this kind of quickly because I want to make sure we have time to share for just a couple minutes at least. Really ask yourself, am I being pulled towards jurisdiction, slipping into judgment, or am I resting in, actively resting in discernment with relational sensing and more open temporality? Now, we call our organization Otherwise, and that's both carrying the sort of unless energy at the end of the book, The Lorax, right? That like we got to do some things really different otherwise, but also that we need to open ourselves to a wide array of other wisdoms, um, and that we need to enhance our other awareness, our awareness of the other and the relationship and the shifting edges between. And there are lots of early explorations about, well, what do we mean by wisdom? And I don't have a definition, and I won't have just one at any point. But one flavor of it might be that wisdom starts to emerge from a collective body of metabolized discernment over lifetimes, shared, storied, woven into culture, carried, sung. And so we can look to those wisdom traditions. And notice that wisdom tends to arrive when experience has been digested, when complicity and harm, when errors have been faced, when fantasies have been composted, and when nervous systems actually can tolerate ambiguity. Wisdom alone doesn't necessarily disarm danger, but when we get closer to it, we get away from the hot takes and the quick solutions and the easy methods, we might increase our capacity for adaptive coherence and for really deeply responsible ability to respond, action. So I like to ask myself as I start to have insights, and I have the kind of brain that generates insights all the time. It's overwhelming. That's my part of my neurotype. Um, I have to not act on them all the time. I have to like slow down and figure out what needs time to ripen. What do I need to actually take with me on a walk? What do I need to tuck underground and let do its thing for a while? What needs a companion? What do I need to externalize and talk out loud with another being or another human? What might need a guardian, either from my own energy or for something else? And what can remain provisional for a little while longer? Okay, I want to simplify this a ton because a lot of that is conceptual, even though it also connects to embodiment practice and somatic practice. Um, I've also written about this in a really tangible way. And there's an essay on our Otherwise website, the blog called The Other Ways, called Provisioning Plenty and Discerning Enough, where I talk about how in the sort of like August and September part of the year up here in northern Vermont and northern hemisphere, uh, my garden gets really full and my kitchen gets really full, and I have to figure out what to do with all of the abundance that I have. It's a great problem to have, but it does require discernment. And the essay itself is much more beautiful than this, but you can also sort of skip over everything I just talked about and enter a harvest metaphor. And just imagine, what do I have to eat right now? Because it is perfect and like this is the most juicy, perfect, ripe tomato, and it needs to be enjoyed in this moment. And what if that maybe I have too many of and I need to share? What do I need to leave on the vine to ripen? What do I preserve for later and how, right? What gets jarred and canned? What gets frozen? Um, what gets dried? What am I giving to others? What am I keeping here? What will I put in the compost to tend and what can just rot in place? And for me as a gardener, entering that metaphor is really useful. And it's also really helpful when I am stuck in my inbox or when I have too many projects or invitations or opportunities. So I wanted to offer it in that slightly more concrete way. And I also wanted to say that when you mess up, because your discernment will sometimes get things wrong, that there's a whole practice here. And I'm going to clean up my practice pages and share them with the rec organizers so that you can have access to them afterwards. Um, your discernment will fail you sometimes. You will still make mistakes. There are no guarantees here. When I mess up, I try to name the miss, like out loud, gently to myself, but in front of someone else. I go back to that braid of gut and heart and breath and brain. I go back and I do the resort. What did I get wrong? What did I let leave to rot that I really shouldn't have? And now there's maggots all over. Where did I stop tending the compost? What did I not preserve properly and is now kind of toxic and poisonous? Um, I do start with a small repair gesture. And I invite others to witness the process, not necessarily to issue a verdict on it, to be part of it. And I often tell the story, and I try to tell it in a number of different ways, turning the story as compost rather than getting trapped inside of one story. And if it's really bad, there might need to be a repair and retying ritual. So, with that, um, let's see. I'd love to give you a moment to share anything we're so close to the end of our time here, huh, Anna?
No, we actually have quite a bit more. I
Oh,
have I have the session for about 45 minutes more. Let me double check,
oh,
but that it was so we are 1 hour in, and yours
perfect.
was longer. But let me just double check
Well, if
to make
that's
sure
if
that.
that's the case, I have so much more I can do. But I thought I was sent something that said an hour, and I was like, this is gonna be really hard to do in an hour.
So in my schedule and in the schedule, it is on for 45 more seconds, 45 more minutes.
Minutes. Perfect, perfect,
Yes.
great. There's much more we can do. This is wonderful. Okay, so let me go back. And actually, I'm going to just take the screen share down for a minute so I can see all of you and I can hold space a little differently. Has that returned you to me? Yes. Okay. So first, I would just like to let me give myself a second. I would have given you much more time for all of those reflections and writing. Ah, here we go. All right. Catching up on the chat. So, is anyone feeling, let me first create space for questions now that we have a little bit of time. And anything you might want me to return to or think about or that you have perspectives on that overlap with mine or are different. And you can just come off of mute if that's easier for you. Does discernment feel like something that's a newer concept? Does it feel different than the ways you've approached sense making or deciding in the past? Another question that might bring us into conversation is, does this feel similar to or different than the way you're given space to figure out what to do at work, in your family, um, in groups you organize with? What's similar and what's different? Suruchi, come on in.
Hi, Nicole. Sorry, I'm off video, but
That's okay.
that's um thank you for the session. I joined late, but I did catch the things at the right time. Um, I have a question. I think it's related to what we are holding space for. If you don't have the time to make decisions out from that place of, when we I guess I do understand discernment, and I think I've been experiencing it differently in making decisions. My question is, if we don't get the time, and I think I'm saying in context to a family situation, but we do know that it's a compromise decision. I'm just trying to figure it out how to navigate those situations, I believe. Especially knowing that perhaps I'll make mistakes along the way. And yeah, I just don't have the time I need to process while I'm still taking it, and that brings a lot of guilt.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. So there's a little bit of idealization in some of this, right? Because um, there are plenty of times when we have to make decisions fast, when we have to act fast. I will say that the more space for reflection that we can build into our lives and our relationships generally, the more tensile strength those relationships tend to have when we get into those moments of urgency. And yet, and still, sometimes we find ourselves not having had the opportunity, the conditions to do that pre-work, and still having to make decisions quickly. One thing that I've noticed for myself with this is that even in pretty fast-moving situations, I can stop and I can ask others around myself to stop and use my breath a little bit to notice where I'm holding, to notice where I'm clenching, to notice, to ask really people I trust in those situations to reflect back patterns to me of how I'm showing up. And I'm going to give you a personal example. Um, I went through a situation that was fairly combative over the course of about a year or two. And I had to make some hard choices. I lost some friendships. I had to defend what I was doing in a lot of ways. And so this is not one of those urgent situations, but one of those ongoing ones. And as a result of that ongoing situation, even when I was past it, I was still showing up in other situations, some that were much more urgent, with that energy. And I didn't notice the pattern in myself until a really trusted friend said to me, "You're hardened in a way that you weren't before. And you have some stuff around your own edges now that, like, is really sharp. And I know that this isn't you." And the first couple of times that she said it to me, I didn't, I wasn't able to fully understand it because I thought she was communicating to me that I had hurt her, but rather she was noticing a pattern of how I was acting and reacting. And so I think sometimes, even when things are moving pretty fast, even when you're in suboptimal situations or a tight family dynamic, just figuring out what little bit of space you can create to notice those patterns in yourself, to notice the proportionality of your response can make a huge difference. And if you're either so activated or so frozen, hot or cold, sort of skewed in one direction or the other, and sometimes you're both at the same time. That's tricky too. We can talk about that. You need someone else to be able to kind of help hold up that mirror or say what they're noticing without taking that as the truth of who you are, right? Like without receiving it as judgment. And so, yeah, for me, I think taking that time to check in, like gut, heart, breath, brain, what is each telling me? And I did this last week between, it was very suboptimal. It was between 2:30 and 4:30 in the morning and a lot of journaling. But yeah, and I didn't have somebody to talk to at that time of night. So, it would have been a good thing perhaps to discuss with a trusted friend. But honestly, I had a lot of shame around it too. And I think I had to do some of it with myself in that 2 hour period, um, sacrificing sleep, which is not always optimal, but walking through each of those and letting myself like presence what my gut was telling me on the same piece of paper where I was presencing what I was reasoning through, right? And like holding them in equal regard, letting me tap into what I was really feeling in my heart and noticing in my body. Um, Breathing differently, breathing in different ways and seeing what came up and making it embodied and intellectual, felt and worded in layers was really powerful for me. And I was able to do it in just a couple of hours and get so much more clarity without certainty. I'm still not certain that the thing that I chose to do next was the best thing, but it was a small, responsible step within my reach that enabled me to recalibrate the balance between permeability and protection. Um, and so that's really what I'm recommending. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm just jumping in with an update.
Yes,
Just tapping into this beautiful invitation of spaciousness that you just mentioned, because you were actually right. The session was scheduled for 1 hour. It was like a mismatch across the many spreadsheets that we work with. However, as spaciousness today works into our flow, there is nothing scheduled in this room for the next 40 minutes or so. So just wanted to invite that as well. The session did end. We do, however, have the space to extend it. Thank you.
wonderful.
And
Well, I'm
sorry
happy
for the
to,
confusion.
yes, I'm happy to hold a little bit more space. I will double check my own calendar, but I don't think I had booked anything right after this, other than someone coming to do a small bit of construction on the stairs, which might happen at 1. So let's keep going. Let's see, Juan, I see your hand up, and then
No,
Vespera
but Vespera was first,
was
so
first. Okay, go
yeah.
ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation and your language. I really feel like you really gave such wonderfully resonant language to really honestly relatable feelings, like all across, like everything that you mentioned. Like I'm like, wow, that's what I can call it now, and it's really helpful. Um, I'm curious about, I was thinking about hot stress and cold stress, and this, I feel like I go through hot stress and cold stress so much in this, and when I'm making any decision or at any juncture of my life, it feels like it's a kind of a dance between the two. And in the past, I always thought of those feelings like overestimating a threat or seeking control, or those I always misunderstood them, I guess, as like my gut. I receive those kinds of signals as like signals from, I guess I guess my question is kind of like, how do you distinguish the braids signals as, especially when in the midst of the actual stressors, you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like, because like at the moment I'm like, well, this is my gut clearly, and like that's my heart speaking, and then afterwards I'm like, well, when I see this laid out as stress, I'm like, oh, I can also see that as activation. So yeah, I was wondering.
So, yeah, a thing that I feel like is important to say is a lot of the work that I find myself interested in right now, um, is what you might call sort of transitional practice. And I'm going to tie this also to, I think it was Roy's question in the chat about like, oh, are there ties here to Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous practice? And like, yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's sometimes different between wisdom traditions and some of the methods, the modalities that I have been exploring is that some of what I'm trying to figure out how to do is how to recover what Vanessa Andreotti calls exiled capacities, the capacities that have been stilled and silenced within modernity, coloniality, or by capitalism and transactionalism and consumerism, things that sort of like post-Enlightenment rationality has pushed off to the side, patriarchy has pushed off to this, any number of the horrible isms, right, has like told us to get rid of. And so there is both sort of what we can reach back to in indigenous wisdoms and practices that have these really long traditions, and then the things that we can reach for now that help us reconnect and recover. And because I come from a disrupted lineage, I tend to work more in that kind of recover space. Now, how does that connect to your very specific question about the figuring out which are the strands of the braids? I suspect, but I can't prove, that like at a much earlier point, we might have felt those signals more clearly and we might have trusted them more clearly. Like we might have had a lot less external stuff to manage. Not that we would have had less sensory input, right? We're living in these lush sensory environments, landscapes, like very immediate, but that we wouldn't have been so over conditioned to logic everything out, to think everything through, to still our intuition. And we probably would have like noticed our own heartbeat more. We probably would have noticed many of the, like our sort of interoception in the scientific word would have been more present and clearer. And what I hear in your question is like, yeah, but that's not how I grew up. That's not how, and like, I just like sort of have been conditioned, taught, encouraged to think about it as like, is this my instinct and my intuition? Is this a gut reaction? Or am I being logical and rational and thinking this through? And part of what the discernment braid for me adds is the ability to say, actually, my intuition is like lush and layered, and that there are multiple systems in my body that are providing me with information and the ability to co-regulate. And so it does sort of require at least a couple of minutes of slowing down to let that regulation happen, to look at it really quickly. I cannot do this in an acute crisis in the moment of acute crisis. So I remember being in a moment on the side, on the platform of a New York City subway, 456 line, when someone fell into the tracks. And in that acute moment of trying to mobilize, I probably would not have like slowed down enough to discern what was my instinct versus what was my, like, we just had to figure out how to, as a group of people, get this person who had passed out off the tracks, right? Um, Before the next train came. And yet, anything that's a little bit slower than that, I try really hard to just take a minute and notice if I'm over selecting for this very highly overdeveloped intellectual capacity that I have,
Mm.
right? And if I am, and I often am, I really often am, like, can I then shift a little bit to the other side? And as I do, not treat it all as one jumble, right? Like, where am I clenching? What is like the deepest part of my heart telling me, even if it's out of sync with the way I'm like rationalizing this. And with the more space that I have around a discernment process, the more I can actually tease those apart. I will say that in trying it, I can usually look pretty quickly and notice, like, imagine it was your hair that was braided or a piece of macrame. You can look at it pretty quickly and notice where there's a loop pulled out, where the hair is popping out the side, right? And so while you can't necessarily quickly, like, really tune into all of it, you can pretty quickly spot, like, I am holding my breath as I do this. Something is wrong.
Mm.
You
Mm.
know? I haven't reached a place of ease. And if it's the kind of emergency where, like, you know what? I am the fittest person on this platform and I'm gonna have to be the one that goes in, which was not the case in that moment for me. Like, I might do it holding my breath because I am really scared. In the context, that might be okay. But if I'm in a situation that has a little more space than that, then that's the thing that I'm going to tune into next and try to regulate a little bit more. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Juan.
I was just maybe wondering or remembering that some of the practices that I do with the teams that I work with that have a lot of complexity and anxiety because they see no ending or they see no path clear. What we have tried to do is to practice some rituals, and those rituals have been very useful for us to make time, to make space, and to allow ourselves. But at the beginning, it was very hard because the behaviors were like, we're losing time. This is not enough. This is not useful. We're not getting anywhere. And this idea of time, productivity, and results or an outcome has become this tension that we are trying to see inside within, but not to see the whole system or to see the whole complexity. And it is like your brain is always, or at least that's my perception, it might be biased, but what I'm seeing is that we're not trusting our own system. It's like an outer system. It's like I have to see the data, I have to see the information, I have to see the incomes and to see the input, sorry. And with those, I can make a decision, not allowing the body or the sense of the whole community to engage into a collective brain.
Yes.
So I don't know if you have any examples of rituals because I try not to make them a practice, but to hold them as something precious that you
Yeah.
have to use in a special moment and not like this is the method and this is the methodology, and you have to follow this script in order to allow discernment to appear or to emerge, but just to know when to use it. So
Yeah.
it's very tricky because it's judged from the outside like you're in this philosophy state or you're just like improvising, but it's very difficult for as a facilitator to honor that mystery and to hold it as something that you have to honor because it's a knowledge that it's invisible and it's in a field and it's not in front of you. So I'm trying to find different rituals where I can hold to in order to feel that discernment within me, like you did at the beginning with our breathing exercise. But in some context, that's very difficult for us to allow that because it feels tree hugging or it feels, like this is a hippie ritual and this is not corporate or this is not useful. So that tension has been very interesting, but what I'm sensing is that not everyone is ready for that.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that discernment is something that it comes with some sort of awareness, and maybe we have to start in a different plane. Like we have to do the self work of your own awareness. And once you feel that you are ready for that, maybe you can allow new words to appear. This vocabulary of how to deal with uncertainty and chaos and everything that surrounds us. So if you have any rituals that have worked for you, that will be great.
So you and I are exploring a similar learning edge right now, I think. And I like plus one, everything you're just saying, I've experienced it so much. I have also really like reflected on some professional failures in my own life and in my own leadership and noticed that where I really think I went wrong was in not insisting on the space for the hospicing and the midwifery, the breaking down and the attending, the moving between the intellectual accountability and existential accountability and intellectual surrender. Like that, I can now look back at something that could have gone a really different way, um, and say, man, if I had been braver, like if I had insisted more on what I instinctually in my gut, in my heart, in my breath knew we needed, but intellectually and like dominant culturally, institutionally, we were all like, there's no time for that. We're all doing this the way we're supposed to be doing, Um, that I think like there could have been a different, would it have guaranteed a different outcome? No. Would people have necessarily come to it in good faith? Some and not others, right? Like, would some people have resented it? Possibly. I don't know that it would have averted the really, unfortunate outcome that happened instead. But when I look back at this moment where, yeah, I tried to lead a really ambitious thing and it failed, the thing I can point to most is that we didn't make space for the hospicing, the composting, or for the ritual around the work we were going to begin together. Um, in my own evolving practice, I try to save the word ritual for something that really does feel like it is taking us out of the ordinary, connecting to the sacred, maybe rites of passage and transition. I do try to bring in practices like groundings to meetings, to more ordinary convenings to try to help create the level of comfort and tolerance with engaging beyond like, okay, here we are for our 10 o'clock and like, here's what, the spreadsheet says and here's just what's on the agenda. So I try to create a little space within agendas by like sort of insisting that otherwise we begin all of our other wisdom circles with a grounding. And sometimes it's long and really spacious, and sometimes it's quick and potent, but we always do it because it allows us to come into space a little bit differently, and it creates that necessary distinction from the way we show up in other spaces. And so doing that, I think, has helped me to kind of repattern people's expectations for what is possible in a space by often opening with a grounding and sometimes closing with a blessing. Or, and this is a really basic one too, like a practice that when our technology allows it, that I love is not hitting the big red button at the end of a Zoom call, but instead putting a song on and telling people that they can leave when feels right to them, which might be the very moment that song starts to play because the event is over, and which might be just 3 minutes of listening to something you wouldn't have put on for yourself and letting yourself transition. And these things are not like what I would necessarily call those deep rituals that attend to the sacred fully, but they soften the edges. They create a different kind of tone and texture to the way we come together, which I think shifts what the containers that we create together can hold. And I wish I had done more of this when I wish I had been able to try more of this and been brave enough to try more of this when I was in a context not of my own making, you know? So I don't know if that's a full answer to your question, but it's what's coming up. And I did recently actually um, buy a book that's sitting on my nightstand and I haven't opened yet around rites and rituals, particularly with young people, adolescents, and the missing rituals of transition. But I think you're right. I think about transactionality. I did a lot of writing when I was in the food system space fully on moving from sort of transactionality to deeper relationalities, right? With transactionality being one form of relation, but the most kind of thinned out, denuded, um, very quantifiable, fast moving form of relationality. And yeah, there's just like we're so conditioned to put things in ledgers, to make lists, to do all of these things, and they're helpful. I'm a good list maker, but they're not it. They're not all of it. Ooh, I can see I need to catch up on this chat a little bit. Um, Roy, I'm noticing some of your questions, and when I said before that I am like not at all trained in or an expert in polyvagal theory, I will say that like a lot of what you're mentioning, especially around the window of tolerance and um, some of these other concepts, my co-author for the book that I was just mentioning, where we feeding each other, shaping change in food systems through relationship. She is very steeped in all of this, and it's where I came into contact with it. And as she has taught me about the window of tolerance and change processes, yes, I do think cold and hot stress are other ways of understanding, can be other ways of understanding sort of the frame around the window of tolerance for sure. Let's see what else is in this. Ooh, is the idea of a wrong decision a colonized idea? This is a great question. Um, one of the things that I've really had to figure out is like, what kind of wrong do I mean? Is it a mistake? Is it like a pretty grievous error? Is it a failure, professional failure, like I was just talking around, not quite about in detail because it's still a live situation? Um, is it what feels like more of a moral or ethical wrong that would that amounts to me having violated some core values? And so that's where I think it is really helpful to also spend some time identifying your own values, not in a fixed way, um, the values of an organization or an effort that you're in. One of the first things that we did at Otherwise, Eric and I worked hard on a set of values and how to articulate them um, in such a way that they would use the kind of language you just heard me use, but also could be presented to and understood by someone who wasn't steeped in this discourse yet. So what are those values and how am I expressing them and what layers of depth? Because I do think that sometimes I get things wrong in a way where I've strayed from those values. Um, but sometimes I just kind of, yeah, didn't make the best choice in a situation. And I think one of the things that I think we're really struggling with is that we there are so many lacunae, holes in our vocabulary in English. We lack a lot of words to hold a lot of nuance. And so like wrong decision covers a whole lot of territory, right? From things that are really like grievous and ethically implicated to things that were just like, ah, shit, that was a bad use of resources. Like, ugh, that was a poor hiring decision, or that meeting did not go well, right? And so I try to like create a little neural regulation, right, around that because sometimes I can experience all of those errors, wrongs as the same, and they're not.
I have a question follow-up, if okay.
Yeah, please.
Do you think sometimes those mistakes are what bring us closer to our values again?
Absolutely.
Mm,
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought that up. Um, I put the slide up at the end about when you mess up. The reason it's so important to go through that process, and it's not just about discernment either. Like, even if you didn't do any of the discernment process, I would still say, like, hey, let me help you out with this when you mess up thing. Because I grew up with a lot of shame about getting things wrong. I grew up with a lot of shame about not knowing things. Like, I don't know if any of you were raised like this or picked this up. I don't want to universalize this, but I grew up sort of like when someone would say to me, I was a first generation college student, and I did it. I went and I kept going, kept going back. I got a whole bunch of degrees. But I was the first person in my family to go to college. And so when I got there, everyone else, like their families had listened to jazz and classical music, and they were aware of art and poetry that I had no sense of. And they'd been on these fabulous vacations and traveled the world. And um, they knew the names of philosophers. And I couldn't even figure out what was the name of the philosopher and what was the title of the book, kind of thing. And so I kind of masked and learned to pretend that I knew. And so people would be like, for years, people would be like, "Oh, do you know such and such?" And I'd pretend that I did because it was embarrassing to constantly say no. And I mean, I was probably in my mid 30s before I realized that that was not helping me, that that was not an adaptive practice, right? And so if I spent so much time, like decades, not being able to say, no, I don't know that. No, I haven't encountered that. Then was I at all prepared to be able to say, like, wow, I didn't get that right? And like learning from failure, learning from mistake, learning from getting it wrong, learning from fucking up and like actually hurting people, and then going into the process of repair. And Roy, you said something about circle practice in the chat. I have, if you mean like restorative and transformative justice circle practice, yeah, I'm trained in that too. And I've learned so much from those practices as well that like, you know, we don't want to be careless. We don't want to do harm and mess up in ways that like we're kind of working stuff out on each other and be heedless about it. But many of my most profound learnings, frankly, including the learning in this talk about the difference between discernment, judgment, and jurisdiction, come from having gotten it wrong. Like you've mostly just encountered the results of messing up and recalibrating and repairing. Yeah. Roy.
So much, Nicole. I really enjoyed what you had to present to us. There's so many connections. I'm a trainer in circle practice and restorative justice practices, and so many of the things that we teach in the trainings are, connected and integrated to what you've been talking to us about. Another connection that came to mind is John Braithwaite. Do you know John Braithwaite? There's like integrative stigmatizing versus reintegrative shame is.
Ooh, that's a new one for me. And
Yeah,
see, I just
really
admitted that's a new one.
That's a really good. There we go. You see, you've grown so much. You admitted that you didn't. So by the way, I do the same thing. I will say I know something rather than have the shame of like, yeah, right. But like, which is actually the point. It's like, so if we make a mistake and cause harm, it is altogether appropriate and fitting to feel bad, to put it in the most, layman's, terms, right? If you don't feel bad, that's actually sociopathic, right? If you hurt people and don't care, that is what we call sociopathy. So, so what he talks about, but it's really all about this is the restorative lesson. It's really all about how we react to shame, right? So if we have built trust and a trusting relationship with someone, and they trust that we have their best interests in heart. In other words, we want them to grow and learn from their mistakes. And we hold them accountable for their mistakes. They can experience what's called reintegrative shame. And you actually can move from a place of shame to taking actions to take responsibility and accountability and repairing harms, and then you shift to a place of pride. Then you feel actually proud that I repaired, I cleaned up the mess that I made, because I really feel bad that I hurt someone or I hurt my community. But if we react to harms that people cause with stigmatizing shame, which is telling them they're a bad person. This is so typical of you. This is the kind of person that you are to your core. That's stigmatizing shame, and it's actually incredibly harmful. So when we say don't shame people, we really mean that stigmatizing shame. But there is a way in which shame can be valuable and actually something that we can help us.
Yeah. I love this. And I feel like it's been several years, maybe like it was during the lockdown parts of the pandemic that I did my first level circle practice training. And I do feel like perhaps my trainer there did touch on some of this, but I definitely want to go back to it more deeply, having also experienced that more reintegrative aspect of shame and experience the not good kind. And I think one of the things that feels very important to me, that I really grew through, is I think like many of us have taken a tour of various social, racial, environmental, climate justice movements and spaces. We've overlapped in those spaces. They like have a lot of our heart. And yet a version of them, and this is sort of what I was gesturing towards when I quickly touched on the ways in which some of our widespread technologies right now are making it harder and harder to discern, and to hold nuance and paradox and tension, is that when those movements got really sort of mass social mediated, right? Like when they became largely online movements, or that's how they were extending their reach. Um, a lot of binary framing came in, right? And so that's where you get things like intent doesn't matter, only impact matters. And oh, if you stepped on someone's toe, you know, would you say I didn't intend to? No, you would apologize for stepping on their toe. And like on one, you can hear that, you can read it in a meme and you can be like, yeah, of course I would. That's right. Only impact matters. But of course both matter, right? And like the both mattering is such an important part of being able to even make space for that kind of reintegrative shame and to experience harm with some grace. And I also recognize that there are more people who are there are certain people who are being asked to provide more of that grace more of the time without being re-resourced for that. But I think there are other ways to address that than pulling out all of the complexity around what's happening in that space between and in those interactions. Because if you reduce all of the complexity and if you just kind of default to the ease of binary sorting and judgment within a community, you are pushing people further and further apart. You're like really doubling down on the ontology, the way of being of separability, and you're not at all making space for that braid of discernment. And like the thing about braiding is we can do it over again. We can go back in and we can mend and we can fix. And sometimes we've got to unravel some stuff to do that. Sometimes we've got to go back a little bit past the break too. Thanks for adding that. It's really important and helpful. Appreciate it. So it looks like we might be coming closer to our second possible closure moment. And I'd like to invite us to revisit discernment for a moment. And I'd like to mention why there were poppy seeds and soil on some of those slides. The ones particularly where I was asking you to journal or to reflect with not nearly enough time. I'm actually kind of glad, by the way, that I wound up rushing us through it a little bit, both because I was actually correct, but more because I'm glad we had time to talk. But why are there poppy seeds and why is there soil? My dear friend and collaborator, Ruta Zemčikovaitė, who is Lithuanian and lives in Berlin, introduced me to the story that's like a very well-known myth in the Baltic region, in Eastern Europe, and in Slavic cultures and countries. Vasilisa the Wise, or Vasilisa the Beautiful. And one of the things that Vasilisa, who is a character who slots in my mind similar to Cinderella, her mother passes away, her father remarries, she has a fairly kind of evil stepmother and stepsister setting, and she gets sent when the fire goes out to the edge of the woods to retrieve the flame from Baba Yaga. One of the things that the Baba Yaga asks her to do is to sort the poppy seeds from the soil. And my friend Ruta really loves this idea of sorting the poppy seeds from the soil as a metaphor for discernment. And if you can picture a poppy seed and you can imagine sprinkling a handful of them into a handful of soil, you know the care it's going to take, the attention it's going to take to do that. And in the Vasilisa story, she's not the one who does it, not on her own, not with the dexterity of her fingers. She's carrying this little wooden doll that her mother gave her before she died, and she tells Vasilisa to feed the doll and to give her water, and that if she does, when she needs her, she can call on her. And so this doll represents some parts of ourselves that need to be fed and watered in order to be able to call on them, to do in the moment the things that we might not actually be able to do. We might not, between sundown and sunup, be able to sit there and pick all the poppy seeds out. But if we've fed and watered these other capacities, perhaps the ones that are a little magical and a little mysterious, that have been handed down, that are ritualized, that we might be able to lean into our innermost intuitions, our psychic capacities, our exiled capacities, and to move closer and closer to wisdom, to move closer and deeper in relationship, and to find safety with capacities and in relations that we might have been conditioned to not prioritize, to not put as much value in. So I wanted to share that story as we wrap up. It's time for us to move on.